Hello, I am Ajurio Evi, and I am part of the leadership team at the Center of Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. On behalf of the Learning Network and the Knowledge Hub, welcome to our webinar. Technology facilitated gender-based violence among teens, closing the gap in Canadian knowledge and resources. That's today's topic. I want to acknowledge that our work is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lewampawak, and Chononton nations. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sobra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampong. We make this acknowledgement to counter the doctrine of discovery and recognize Indigenous land and sovereignty. We also recognize that many Black people were violently displaced to Canada through settler colonialism and slavery. We will continue to work collaboratively with communities to challenge colonialism, anti-Black racism, and further forms of oppression that remain pervasive in Canada and that result in disproportionate impact of gender-based violence on oppressed communities. We are happy to be joined today by Dr. Kathleen Mendes, Dr. Alexa Dodge, Dr. Christopher Ditzel, and Susie Dunn. You can find their full bios in the link we are sharing in the chat with you. They are all involved in the digitally informed youth digital safety research project that aims to empower young people and provide them with tailored resources so they can have safe and enjoyable interactions online and offline. We will first begin with a presentation before we move into our Q&A. So please join me in welcoming our presenters for today. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Hi, welcome everyone. So today we'll be talking to you about our research on technology-facilitated gender-based violence among teens. So technology-facilitated gender-based violence, or TFGBV for short, refers to acts of harm based on one's gender, gender identity, gender expression, or perceived gender that are carried out using technology to some extent. So this could be text message, social media, GPS tracking, and others. Young Canadians are experiencing increasing challenges related to TFGBV, but it's not always clear what the best practices are for responding to these harms, and it's often difficult to determine what resources are available to support young people. So today we'll talk to you about both the challenges and opportunities for addressing TFGBV through research, resources, technology, law, and education. Next slide, please. So the four of us are part of a federally funded research team called Digitally Informed Youth Digital Safety, or DIY Digital Safety for short. So DIY Digital Safety is a 5-year research project that aims to empower young people and provide them with tailored resources so that they can have safe and enjoyable interactions online and offline. This project prioritizes creating research and resources based on the wants and needs of youth themselves. So we're currently in the process of running focus groups with young people about the supports they want and need when they experience tech-facilitated harms. Our goal ultimately is to provide relevant and timely research and resources to foster digital literacy, address tech-facilitated harms, and create safer and more meaningful connections among young people. So we will just each really quickly introduce ourselves, and then I'll tell you about the agenda for our time together today. So I'm Dr. Alexa Dodge. I'm an assistant professor in criminology at St. Mary's University in Halifax, where I research tech-facilitated harms and how we respond to them, both in the law and beyond the law. Do we want to go Katie, Susie, Chris to quickly introduce yourselves?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Katie Mendes, and I'm an associate professor of sociology at Western University.
Hello,
Hi,
everyone. My
everyone.
name.
Oh, Chris, go ahead.
Sorry. Hello, everyone. My name is Christopher Dietzel. You can call me Chris, him. I am a postdoctoral fellow and research associate.
Great, and I'm Susie Dunn. I use she/her pronouns, and I am an assistant professor at Dalhousie University, the Schulich School of Law, where I do a lot of research on both adults and young people's experiences with tech-facilitated violence.
Thanks, everyone. And next slide, please. So here's our agenda for our time together this afternoon. So first, I'll talk about the findings from our recent report on TFGBV among teens in Canada to give you some background on this issue. Then Katie will talk to you about what we can learn from her research on tech-facilitated gender-based violence from the UK. Next, Susie will talk about the legal context related to this issue, including explaining what laws can help and talking about the limits of law as well. After that, Chris will help us understand the role that technology and online resources can play in responding to TFGBV. I will then describe how education can help respond to and challenge tech-facilitated harms. And finally, we'll have time to hear your questions and comments in the Q&A. Next slide, please. So I'll kick us off by briefly presenting on the results of our report titled Technology Facilitated Gender-Based Violence Among Young People, Synthesizing the Research to Promote Digital Safety in Canada. It's a bit of a long name. So the goal of this report was to understand the current state of knowledge on tech-facilitated gender-based violence among teens and to help guide future research and resources. So to do this, we reviewed Canadian research, educational policies, curricula, and resources to develop an understanding of what we currently know about this topic in Canada and to find the opportunities for improvement in Canadian responses. So we hope that this report will provide the information needed to ensure that Canadian law, policy, and resources related to TFGBV are more evidence-informed in the future, and to inspire future Canadian research projects in this area by revealing current gaps in knowledge. Next slide, please. So what did we find? We found that TFGBV is common and can happen using multiple digital technologies, including messaging platforms, social media, dating apps, online games, and others. For instance, girls report experiencing sexual harassment on popular social media platforms and in multiplayer online games. And technologies such as GPS and AirTags can also be used to track and control girls in their everyday lives. In fact, in our progressively digitized world, we find that it's becoming rare for a case of gender-based violence to not be facilitated by technology in some way. We also found that marginalized groups and those experiencing multiple intersections of marginalization are at a higher risk and are often more severely impacted by TFGBV. For instance, women and girls of color often deal with online threats of sexual assault that are combined with racist epithets. And international research has consistently found that gay, lesbian, and bisexual people are at a significantly higher risk of experiencing tech-facilitated sexual violence in the form of non-consensual intimate image distribution. And it's especially important to emphasize that although much research on TFGBV to date focuses on the experiences of cisgender women and girls, transgender and gender nonconforming people are experiencing rising levels of tech-facilitated harms, including gender-based trolling, hateful anonymous messages, and doxing. So the research we reviewed found that TFGBV can have serious negative impacts on young people's health and safety. For example, young victims can experience anxiety, depression, and social isolation. And in the most tragic cases, including the Canadian cases of teenagers Amanda Todd and Rehtaeh Parsons and others, young people have taken their own lives in the aftermath of tech-facilitated gender-based and sexual violence. So that was a lot of information. Some of this information is shared in an accessible way in the infographic pictured on this slide. And this is available to download from our website at diydigitalsafety.ca. And it'll soon be available in many, many languages for you all to read and share as you wish as well. So while we found that Canadian researchers studying TFGBV have made many important contributions to understanding the nature of and responses to these acts, There are also many gaps in the existing research in Canada that need to be filled, which leads me to the recommendations from this report. Next slide, please. So our report recommends that much more research is urgently needed to understand TFGBV in the Canadian context. Most importantly, future Canadian research should work to better understand both the rates and impacts of TFGBV in Canada and to better document the impacts on marginalized groups that have been largely excluded from existing studies. We also found that many of our current approaches to providing education on this issue simply do not provide young people with an adequate understanding of TFGBV and fail to discuss many of the beliefs that fuel this harm. For instance, educational programs often fail to acknowledge and challenge sexist and victim-blaming beliefs. In fact, many educational presentations and resources reaffirm victim-blaming beliefs by focusing on how to avoid online victimization without discussing how to respect the rights of others. I'll talk more about better educational approaches later in the webinar. We also found that research and resources need to better explain that technology and tech companies can both facilitate harm and can help to respond to harm through online resources and tools. So Chris will speak more to this topic shortly. We also found that educational messages are often misrepresenting the relevant laws related to TFGBV and could do a much better job of educating young people about relevant laws and about their rights using a rights framework. So Susie will speak to the realities of the law for you shortly. Finally, our report found that we need to hear directly from young people about what they want and need to fill those gaps in supports and resources. So Katie will speak about what she learned about the importance of this youth-engaged approach when she did research with youth on this topic in the UK. So overall, our report on TFGBV among young people, which is available now on our website in both French and English, concludes that Canadian research and resources on TFGBV have grown significantly since the issue began to emerge over a decade ago, yet many gaps still remain. So we hope this report will help inform the Canadian conversation on this topic by revealing what future research contributions are most needed to inform the policies, resources, and laws that will impact the next generation. While much of our report focused on what we don't yet know about TFGBV in Canada, there is a lot that we do know in the emerging research, and that will be the focus of the rest of this webinar. So Katie, take it away with what we can learn from the UK context.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Alexa. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about British teens' experiences of TFGBV. So this talk comes from research that I did in the UK in 2021 with Professor Jessica Ringrose from University College London and Professor Tanya Horrocks from Anglia Ruskin University and our research assistant, Betsy Milne. So this project was funded by Britain's Arts and Humanities Research Council, and it was interested in studying these tech-facilitated harms that 13 to 18-year-olds experience during COVID-19 lockdowns and beyond. Next slide, please. So the talk that I'm going to do today pulls data from a much larger study that draws mixed methods, including an online survey, focus groups, and interviews. So this is all of the data that we collected for the study. And I could speak more generally about the high prevalence of tech-facilitated gender-based violence that participants experience. But today I'm going to focus specifically on the types of harms experienced by sexual and gender minorities and harms that were witnessed against these groups. So from this larger data set, you can see we have over 600 teens. Of these, and again, using different methods, using surveys, using focus groups, between about 2 and 4.5% of both samples identified as gender diverse, and between about 19 and 26% didn't identify as heterosexual. So this includes like a range of other sexualities. In both the survey and focus groups, we not only asked very detailed questions about the types of harms that young people experienced, but also the platforms where it happened on. And we think that this is really important to capture, not just what is going on, but where is this taking place. Next slide, please. I also just wanted to note that this study, just like the research that we are doing here in Canada, uses creative methodologies. And just to kind of say that this plays a really important part in this qualitative analysis. And you're going to see examples of these templates throughout my slides. And this methodology, so where we gave young people these templates, different social media apps or platforms, and we asked them to tell us what they like, what they don't like, things that they find harmful, make them uncomfortable. And this was actually important because sometimes it can be really difficult to find the words to say, you know, your experiences, to talk about harm. And not all participants feel comfortable speaking about this harm in front of others. So this methodology still gives participants a chance to take part in the research and to show, you know, what they like, what they don't like, the harms in a different way. And as researchers, sometimes we can have a better picture of what harm looks like without, for example, having to ask teens to show us their phone. You know, this I think leads to things like invasion of privacy. So the survey in particular was quite long. It was over 100 questions. It was very detailed. And we asked teens about a wide range of harms. And we look about, when we look at all the kinds of harms that we asked, mean messages, harassment, being sent unsolicited nudes, homophobic or racist comments, we found some key statistics. So the next slide, please. Overall, we found 78% of all young people said they experienced at least one type of online harm during this period. And we think that this is a really big statistic. But this statistic gets even bigger when we look at the experiences among sexual and gender minorities. So about 88 or 89% of both gender and sexual minorities experienced harm. Next slide, please. So when it comes specifically to sexuality-based harassment, we found 40% of sexual minorities and 36% of gender minorities experience this. So for example, it might include things like outing or mean comments about their sexual orientation. And we found that, you know, top platforms for getting outed included Instagram and WhatsApp. Top platforms for mean comments included WhatsApp, Instagram, and Snapchat. And these platforms we see keep reoccurring when we spoke to the young people. Next slide, please. When it comes to gender-based harassment, 27% of gender minorities and 35% of sexual minorities experienced offensive and or degrading messages, comments, or jokes about their online gender identity. So top platforms for mean comments about gender include TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, Reddit, and other social gaming platforms. Okay, so we have all this quantitative data that shows high rates of LGBTQ+ discrimination and hate experienced by gender and sexual minorities across social media platforms, but it doesn't really tell us anything specific about the ways in which the platform's features afforded these harms. So this is where the qualitative findings really come in, you know, into their own. And we wanted to find out more about how gender and sexual minorities, how their experiences of, you know, being kind of in these minority groups shape their experiences of harm, including things like transphobia, enforcement of gender binaries, sexuality-based discrimination across various platforms. And again, thinking, what is it about the platform and the affordances that facilitate harms in these new and unique ways? So I won't have time to go into all of the types of harms that we uncovered, but I want to just share a few examples. So the first is with commenting. So next slide, please. Many of the young people spoke about negative, abusive, and upsetting comments that they saw, particularly on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. So here we can see a young person's TikTok template where they captured their experiences of how they dislike seeing hateful comments about people's sexuality. And this was echoed by many other participants who also witnessed hate towards the queer community, especially during things like Pride Month. And when we asked who was doing this hating, people often said they felt it was strangers on the internet who, quote, hide behind a screen, unquote. So here we can see how features like comments, including the anonymity of the commenters hiding behind their username and profiles, and actually a lack of moderation, result in mass witnessing of toxicity that the young people disliked. But they also talked about how they can't really turn it off unless they don't engage with the platform or the influencer. And for them, they felt as though that wasn't something, a compromise they were willing to make. So if the next slide, please. If I move on to another example, which includes creating content. So young people described a range of LGBTQ plus discrimination and hate, which changed based on the app affordances. And I want to speak here about if we're thinking about young people creating TikTok videos, we actually found that this was quite rare. And in fact, young people spoke about the risks of harassment when making their own videos. But we did have one important example that came out, which is when one participant talked about her friends coming out online. So this person created and posted a TikTok video during lockdown. And this person talked about how this led to huge amounts of hate, particularly from one group of boys in their school that called her all sorts of derogatory names and making jokes about her doing weird stuff with her cousin. And this participant explained that when her friend came back into the school setting, she received these homophobic remarks from these boys. And I think this experience is important in showing how a young person emulated the types of videos that they found in their TikTok algorithm for coming out. So they were seeing lots of TikTok videos where other people were coming out. And so this created a perceived sense of privacy or safety in posting this raw and emotional content, because this is the kind of content that they were being fed that was tailored by the algorithms in their For You page. And so we argue that this actually creates new norms online where they feel safe, where this is a way that people express themselves, their sexuality, but this backfired when they went back into school, where this person was up against different sets of gender, sexuality, norms, and values. So it really raises this question of how does the TikTok algorithm change expectations that maybe don't resonate with the dominant peer group in school. Okay, next slide, please. And actually, I want to point out with that example that the hate in this case didn't occur on TikTok. In fact, this participant talks about how everyone on TikTok actually supported the person coming out, but the hate appeared across other platforms. So it was a TikTok video that was kind of taken and shared across other platforms. And this is illustrated in this quote. So she did a TikTok about being bisexual. People were saving it and putting it on their stories on Instagram. And everyone found out. Everyone was putting it on their stories. And then she did a live video that day explaining on her video how she was getting so much hate, like huge amounts. It was unbelievable. So, we have kind of on one hand, TikTok content that's understood as being authentic and compared to other apps, and it's also used for fun. And so this also created this affordance or a sense of privacy, but this created a condition where the user felt comfortable posting content of themselves on TikTok that was raw and emotional compared to maybe what they would see on other platforms. So this content creator may have had a sense of security on TikTok because of the community feeling that the algorithm curated. But because of the ease of spreadability of content across platforms, these new opportunities for hate were created on Snapchat and Instagram stories. And I also want to just finally, next slide, please. Talk about how affordances of anonymity, particularly on a platform called Telenym, compounded dissemination of hate. So for those of you who don't know, Telenym is a platform. It became very popular during lockdown. The key features where users can create a profile and send anonymous messages. So here we have this example where you can ask a question and you can get anonymous tells, which easily enables users to hide behind the screen, and they can post really hurtful or abusive posts. And again, we see this icon of the paper bag here. So the girls went on to describe how their friend had a link on her Telenym profile in her bio on Instagram and TikTok, and she received an abundance of anonymous hateful messages on the platform following the spread of her coming out video. And the girls talked about how being online impacted the response. One person said maybe that would have stopped them saying as much as they did, because that app, you can literally just say anything and it won't get traced back to you. So there's also this implication that in lockdown created these different conditions where young people perhaps posted content that they wouldn't normally have done. And also how sexuality may be lived differently in online spaces, where maybe there is a sense of safety and support that's cultivated, but homophobia in school based in group networks actually creates massive risks. I have lots more examples that I can share of how people who post images and videos of Snapchat and Instagram stories would receive discriminatory messages that I just don't have time to go into. I could talk a lot more, especially about Instagram and Snapchat, on expressing, witnessing LGBTQ plus discrimination, disappearing snaps, the non-consensual sharing of intimate images. But I'll just conclude with this last slide, please. Which is to say that sexuality and gender diverse youth are experiencing higher rates of tech-facilitated gender-based sexual violence than heterosexual and cisgendered youth. And the truth is we simply don't know enough about the platform's specific forms of this harm and abuse for sexual and gender minority youth. And I think we need to really make sure we're prioritizing and take seriously these experiences. They're also experiencing particular forms of tech-facilitated gender-based violence, including sexuality-based harassment, outing, and other mean comments about their gender. And we need to pay attention to where the harm is happening, as well as the kinds of harms that they face, so that we can start to push for change. Thank you.
Great. Hi, everyone. So I'm doing the legal portion of this conversation. And I think it's really interesting when we talk about law and young people, because in reality, from all of the research that I've seen in this area, it's actually relatively rare that it's necessary or even practical for young people to use the law as a tool. Of course, in serious situations, especially as adults who have a requirement to report, there are many incidences of online gender-based violence that need to be reported to the police, or there may be options in civil law for young people's rights to be realized. But the reality is most young people won't ever actually use the law. But that being said, the knowledge about what their rights are and the knowledge about what laws exist, where the Canadian state has said this is illegal, this is improper behavior, can be a really, really, really helpful tool for young people to be able to express themselves and to be able to stand up for themselves. So even if young people aren't in reality actually using the legal system as a primary tool of solving their problems and dealing with online gender-based violence, it's actually quite helpful for them to know what the laws are so that they can speak up for themselves. Next slide. So the two areas of law that I'll talk about are criminal and civil law, which are the main kind of individual on individual types of harms. But there are a multitude of other laws that can apply to this area. So for example, in Canada right now, the Canadian government has announced that it will be releasing an online harms bill, and that online harms bill will actually moderate, ideally it will hopefully moderate help regulate the moderation of social media companies. What we see is that young people actually do use social media companies more often than not to report things that are happening to them. So having positive responses from social media companies that have good content moderation is an important area of the law. But today I'll just be talking about criminal law and civil law. And so criminal law, there's pros and cons for using it. The pros are that the investigation is done by the state. The police have a lot of power to do investigations into crimes that have occurred. And so there's real benefits for accessing criminal law. The challenges with criminal law is that, there's institutional sexism within criminal law. Some people might not want to criminalize the person who has caused the harm, even if it's illegal. There is historic bias in criminal justice systems, where some communities, particularly the Indigenous community and Black community in Canada, might have legitimate reasons to not want to engage in criminal law. But it is an option available for young people. And often what people call for whenever there's these new harms, we hear about something like sexual extortion occurring online, and we're often calling for new laws, like as though if we had new laws, it would solve these issues. But what we can see is that often we already have existing laws on the books that can apply to these types of harms, as long as they're applied properly. So for example, in Canada, we have harassment laws, we have extortion laws, we have laws around sexual contact with children, and those laws apply whether they're occurring online or offline. So for example, during COVID, one of the recent trends that we saw was that a lot of people, including young people, started engaging in sexual relationships online because we couldn't contact each other in person. And in some of these cases, particularly with young boys, what was happening was that people were pretending to be potential sexual partners for these young people. And once they shared their sexual images, they were using that to extort money out of them, which was extremely distressful for young people. But that type of behavior fits within existing law in Canada, such as the Canadian extortion law under the Criminal Code of Canada. So it can be helpful to understand what laws exist already, what text-specific laws exist, which if you go to the next slide, I could speak to those, and then also to think about where there might be gaps and where we might need to move forward. So if we go to the next slide, we can see some of the laws, thank you. We can see some of the laws that have been developed that are very text specific. So as technology is evolving, the Canadian government has introduced new laws over time. So in the early days of the internet, there was a lot of concerns around child pornography laws because we were starting to see the proliferation of child pornography on the internet. And so this was a new form of harm that was introduced because of the use of cameras and the internet. But when we're talking to young people about the law, to people about the criminal law and particularly child pornography, one challenge that we've seen is that young people are often taught a very fear-based focus on the law. So with child pornography, young people are often misinformed. Oh, sorry, you can go back to one slide. I was still on the previous slide. Young people are often misinformed about child pornography laws and are told that no matter what they're doing, if they take a nude photo of themselves, then this is illegal and this is child pornography. But in fact, in Canada, there was a Supreme Court of Canada case called RV Sharp that says if the image is taken for private use, then it's not actually child pornography. So things like if a 12-year-old takes a nude photo of their body and they don't share it with anybody else, that's not exploiting children. That's not harming children, which is what child pornography laws are supposed to protect. And so in fact, that's not actually captured within our criminal law. This is also true of young people who are engaged in legal sexual activity. So if you have sexual partners who are 16 years old, who might have taken sexual photos of each other and shared them with each other, but not with anyone else, that also fits within the private exception rule. And so it's important that young people know that digital sexuality is a normal part of growing up, and there are aspects of it where it's normal behavior, it's healthy behavior. But if that behavior becomes exploitative and it's adults that are doing that to them, or it's people who are sharing it without consent, or people that are threatening them, then at that point, the laws around that type of content can change. And so we need to be really good about the ways that we're informing youth. And sorry, if you can go back to the previous slide, we're kind of jumping around on things. It'd be helpful for me to see my notes on it. And so over time, as technology has changed, there's also been the introduction of other criminal laws, including voyeurism and the non-consensual distribution of intimate images. And so voyeurism, there's been two really interesting cases that have come up, both involving youth. And again, even though young people don't use these laws very often, it can be helpful for young people to bring these cases forward to help define the law. So in RV Jarvis, the voyeurism case, it was a case where a high school teacher had been secretly taking cleavage shots of his teenage students. And there was a question around this legal concept of the reasonable expectation of privacy and whether girls had an expectation of privacy to be free from these sexualized photos in their schools. And ultimately at the Supreme Court of Canada, they did determine that girls do have this reasonable expectation of privacy, even though they're out in semi-public places, because of the way that digital technologies change the way that we interact with each other in spaces. And these secret sexualized photos did fit within voyeurism laws. Similarly, in a case last year, RV Downs is another voyeurism case where a hockey coach was taking secret photos of his athletes in a change room. And there was a question, voyeurism's illegal if you take secret photos in places where you're likely to get changed or have sex. And there was an argument that because young boys who are 12 or 13 aren't typically fully naked in these change rooms, that it didn't actually fit within the voyeurism laws because they weren't exactly naked at the time. But luckily at the Supreme Court of Canada, they've interpreted that to say no. Change rooms, bedrooms, and bathrooms are fundamentally private places where young people should be able to get changed without fear of having people take secret sexualized photos of them. And then in our civil laws, so if we move forward 2 slides, our civil laws, we've seen a really interesting evolution of our civil laws. So we've seen the introduction of the non-consensual distribution of intimate image laws in almost all provinces across Canada. There's now a civil option. And the benefits of a civil option is that someone can go to court without criminalizing another person and get a court order that says the images need to be taken down, which ultimately is what most young people want. But it can be quite difficult to get those types of orders. So now across Canada, it's generally accessible for young people to get these orders. The challenge with civil law is it's very expensive, and most young people cannot afford a full civil case. So fortunately, in British Columbia, the newest iteration of their laws actually has a fast track option where people can file at the civil tribunal and get a relatively quick order to get that content taken down. That's also relatively inexpensive. They're in the process of developing those regulations now, but it should be out within the next year. And then depending on where you're living, if you're in Nova Scotia or if you're in Manitoba, what you'll see is that in both of those provinces, there's statutorily enacted bodies that can help provide supports for people. So in Manitoba, C3P, you can call them if your intimate images or a young person's intimate images have been shared, and they can provide certain supports. Cyberscan in Nova Scotia has quite a broad law that covers intimate images as well as various forms of online harassment and cyberbullying. And then across Canada, we've seen introduction of other laws. There's online harassment laws in Ontario. In Quebec, there's fairly robust image protection laws. Even if you're not nude in those images, you have a right to your image and your privacy under the Civil Code and the Charter in Quebec. And so there's a wide variety of laws that are being developed at this time that can be useful for young people to use in certain circumstances. But even if they're not choosing to use the legal system, it's really important that they know their rights. And our website will have some good plain language descriptions of the various laws that apply in Canada to tech-facilitated gender-based violence. But I'll also share some websites, techsafety.ca and a few other websites that already do have some explanations of the laws in Canada, PrevNet, that you can access now. But over time, our website will also have some plain language descriptions of applicable laws. And I'll pass it off to Chris.
Thank you, Susie. So in my section, if you can go to the next slide, please. I'm going to be talking about online harms and resources to address those harms. Next slide. So first, just to get us started, and many of us, like Katie, Susie, and Alexa have referred to these already, but I wanted to start my section by just really breaking it down, how technology can facilitate harm. And as my colleagues have noted in their presentations, there's a variety of ways in which people can experience harm online and offline. So firstly, as we've been talking about, we know that harms can be facilitated interpersonally online. This can take the form of text messages, as well as images, video, and media. So people can interact with one another through dating apps, through social media. They can interact through online forums, through game-based platforms, and through other types of digital platforms in order to facilitate and perpetrate these online harms. Unfortunately, these harms don't rest online only. When we say technology-facilitated harms, what we mean by this is that the harm is made easier or mediated by technology itself. So what this means, of course, then, is that these are not strictly online harms, but they can also they can go across these spaces so that they don't just stay online, but they happen offline as well. And so some examples of these offline technology facilitated harms would be identity-based harassment. So for example, as we're talking about today, gender-based harms, gender-based violence, sexual violence, these can be based on people's identities. And that particularly means that people of minority identities or marginalized identities are at higher risk or experience higher rates of victimization than people of majority identities. So as Katie talked about, for example, LGBTQ+ people face higher rates of identity-based harassment, of course, than people who have normative genders or sexualities. Another type of violence that can be facilitated by technology but happens offline, of course, is physical violence, sexual violence. And so what we see in these cases is that people will use technology to connect online, but then to perpetrate the violence in person. Another type of violence is GPS-enabled stalking. So using a mobile device in order to find somebody in person to stalk them, that is a form of technology-facilitated harm. And so one example of this is using like the Find Me function, or if you share your location with somebody, then somebody can use that in order to find you. Of course, most of the time this is used in a very positive way or just casually among friends, family, etc. But we also have to keep in mind that partners, particularly coercive partners or others, can use these GPS-enabled devices in order to stalk someone. Surveillance can also happen with smart devices. So there's been some reports online as well as in the research about how people use smart devices like Alexa or Siri or other types of integrated devices in order to survey someone. And of course, this can be done in a very coercive or harmful way. And lastly, in terms of offline technology facilitated harms, there's some very extreme examples, such as doxing and swatting. Doxing being reference to documents or sharing of documents in which somebody's personal information is divulged online. So that could be their phone number, it could be their address, it could be their email, it could be their work routine, specifically where they work, where they live. And the intention with this is to really scare somebody by perpetrating harm and targeting them in both online and offline spaces. Swatting is a practice through which you would call police or other authorities and make a false claim in order to have these authorities show up at someone's house or at their work in order to scare them. So these are very extreme tactics that are done with the intent of victimizing an individual. As my colleagues have also talked about, we have to keep in mind that there's not just interpersonal harms, but technology itself can facilitate violence. And so this can, couple ways in which that we're seeing this is happening right now is certainly through algorithms and artificial intelligence. So while some of this can be very visible in terms of the violence that people can experience, the harms that can be facilitated by technology, this can also be built into the technologies themselves. So for instance, the biases that are in algorithms or the type of content that you're shown, kind of as Katie was talking about in relation to TikTok, the algorithms and artificial intelligence can perpetuate these harms and can really facilitate the type of violence that people either experience or see through their online interactions. And lastly, when we think about organizations, we have to keep in mind that technologies such as social media, dating apps, these different kind of online and offline platforms, they are run by corporations, they're run by companies. And so in this sense, we have to keep in mind what types of policies that they have. And so oftentimes we'll see this in the case of community guidelines. They'll refer to these as like data privacy policies or other types of policies based on the organizational practices of these corporations and businesses that might make it easier or harder for somebody to block someone, to report someone, or certainly in these cases, then to experience harm. Content moderation is another thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about technology facilitated harms. And in this sense, we have to think about not just the policies that are in place, but the practices that are there. So when you do report someone to Facebook, TikTok, whatever, to what extent do those companies to what extent are those claims taken seriously? And so we have to think about the response time, the kind of supports and resources that are provided to individuals who report online harms. But we also have to keep in mind that these types of practices can be exploited. So what we'll see, especially for like queer people or for people of color, for particular political movements, these types of moderation policies can be weaponized against those who are marginalized already and can be taken advantage of in order to actually perpetrate harm against them. So for instance, there were some queer content creators who were being flagged as being inappropriate. And of course, this was just because they were talking about queer issues, but instead they were being policed online through content moderation policies, which then flagged their content and it was marked as inappropriate. Lastly, since we're talking about organizations, we do have to keep in mind that these are business organizations who have profits in mind. So we want to make sure that we are scrutinizing these practices so that we understand that while, of course, they want to keep these spaces safe, their intent is that they're safe for people to use them, which can then be used to generate money, to collect data, etc. So we have to keep that in mind to make sure that we're not thinking about these spaces as neutral, but we are aware of the businesses and the decisions that are being made behind the scenes. Next slide, please. So how do we respond to these different types of technology facilitated harms? Well, first, as I mentioned already, we can use in-platform features such as blocking and reporting, blocking being in order to remove someone from the space, and reporting being flagging that individual or a group or a page, etc., to the organization itself. Of course, as I mentioned already, sometimes these responses are not always, they can be limited in terms of how they protect. And oops, sorry, I'm not moving enough for my, there we go. The light went off. Excuse me for that. The light went off. But yes, as I was saying, blocking and reporting practices can sometimes be limiting. So in terms of other responses, you can get support from organizations, which I'm going to be showing in the next couple slides. In terms of policy interventions, this relates to the kind of work that we are doing currently on our DIY digital safety project. And currently we're working in collaboration with CCAN, which is the Sex Information and Education Council of Canada. I've put the link in this in the chat. We're working with them to develop a report that shares the findings from our analysis of all of the Canadian provinces and territories' educational curricula and policies. So in this report, we've highlighted the extent to which curriculum and policies from across the country address technology-facilitated harms, and that is a report that's forthcoming. So hopefully we'll have that out actually in the next few weeks. Lastly, in terms of responses to technology-facilitated harms, of course, you can go to the legal authorities, which Susie has talked about, but we have to keep in mind that especially with young people or folks from marginalized populations, this is not always a safe or convenient option. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there are resources available to you. First, there's this organization called Right to Be, and this organization is what they do is they provide online resources and support related to social media and harassment. And so as you can see on your screen, which I've also included in the chat, they have a website where you can go to and you can get safety guides for different social media platforms. So as you can see, they have options available for Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, TikTok, Tumblr, Twitter, now X, YouTube, and Zoom. And so these are resource guides that are meant to help people more safely navigate these online spaces. Next slide, please. So this shows you an example of their safety guide for Instagram, for example. And as you can see, they've broken it down in terms of policies and ways to report or block people on these different sites. And they have hyperlinks that gives more information to each of these specific content areas. Next slide. And in terms of other resources, which again, I'm putting the link in the chat, they don't just have resources around social media safety, but they look at they cover a variety of topics on their website. So in terms of addressing online harassment, there's resources for that. They also have resources, information around bystander intervention, self-care, digital security, legal rights, and they also provide resources to organizations as well as workshops and training. What I do have to note with this is although an international organization, it is US based. So in terms of legal rights, these, particularly for us in Canada, they're not the best organization to consult in that regard, but the rest of their information is very, very relevant and useful, particularly regarding digital harms and harassment. Next slide, please. My research is particularly interested in people of diverse genders and sexualities. And so for those folks who have LGBTQ+ identities, there is a digital safety guide that specifically that highlights how people of diverse and minoritized genders and sexualities can be safe and stay safe on these different platforms online. So I highlight this, and here again, there's the link to this resource. They have a guide from GLAAD, which is a US-based organization for using these different websites. Next slide, please. One other thing that I would like to highlight is that on one of the projects that I'm currently doing, not with digital safety, but through my postdoctoral fellowship, is we are developing a digital safety map. And here's the link to our research lab. So what we're doing, and this is particularly related to dating apps. So what we're doing is we're collecting content moderation policies and other policies from 30 different dating apps that are used in Canada. And what we're doing is we're doing an analysis of those policies and their online features to see the extent to which these spaces are safe and to what extent they facilitate harms. And so this is a project that is currently underway. And by next summer, we're going to have an online safety map where people can go to our website and interact in a dynamic way to understand how, kind of like in the same way that I showed in the previous resources with Right to Be and GLAAD, we're going to have this resource, which is specific to dating apps, to provide information about how to stay safe in these spaces. The last thing that I would like to highlight, which I don't have a slide for, but I do want to note that in terms of other resources, of course, our DIY digital safety website, which I put in the chat here, we have a lot of resources both for educators and in terms of support. There's other organizations that we have partnered with that we encourage you to check out, including Media Smarts, which provides information particularly for students, parents, and teachers, as well as techsafety.ca. And so these are two Canadian organizations that provide a lot of resources relevant to the topics that we have talked about today. So I encourage you to check both of those out. And again, those links are in the chat. All right, so at this point, I will turn it back over to Alexa.
Hello again. So for the last section of our webinar today, I'll be talking about approaches to educating young people about TFGBV and related digital harms. Oh, you can go to the next slide, please. So the big takeaway for this section is that many current educational approaches for youth are unhelpful and even harmful. So we need to learn how to avoid some of the common pitfalls in education on this topic, and to instead help young people imagine what more respectful and maybe even joyful digital spaces and relationships could look like. Next slide, please. So I first want to review some of the common shortcomings in current educational approaches, and then I'll talk about what we can do instead. So the first common pitfall is taking a scare tactic approach to education. Scare tactic approaches refer to education that tries to scare young people out of harmful behaviors through education that focuses on harsh legal warnings and threats of punishment. For instance, we often see scare tactic approaches to teaching young people about why they shouldn't share other people's nude images without consent. These approaches tell young people that they shouldn't share nudes of others without consent because if they do, they'll be charged with child pornography and they'll go to prison for up to 14 years. So young people tell me this all the time, that they have police officers, public safety people, other educators come into their schools and say, you're going to go to jail for 14 years. So on top of the fact that it's highly unlikely that a young person will see a prison sentence for sharing nudes without consent in Canada, it's happened very rarely. And besides the fact that it's more likely they would be charged with the offense of non-consensual intimate image distribution for this act, this approach is also unsuccessful because it focuses solely on discussing the risk of punishment and doesn't explain to young people why this act is harmful and why we should protect the privacy rights of others. So although it's important to give young people facts about the legality of such acts, our education should avoid overly focusing on the law and punishment and should instead stress that we don't just avoid sharing nudes without consent and other types of digital harms because it's against the law. Rather, we avoid doing this first and foremost because it's really harmful to others and because others have the right to privacy and to bodily autonomy, and because we're all responsible for ensuring that those rights are protected. The next common pitfall in educational approaches is victim blaming and shaming. So to stay with the nude image example, I regularly see educational approaches that are aimed at changing the behaviors of those who consensually share nude images rather than those who distribute images of others without consent. For instance, when I asked a member of a public safety unit here in Nova Scotia about how they address non-consensual intimate image distribution in presentations to youth, she said, quote, "We talk about how once you take that image of yourself and you hit send, you don't have control of that photo anymore. We use an example that sexting is like going to Costco or Walmart and asking them to print 1,000 photos of you naked and walking around handing out these photos to people. We ask, would you do that? And they all, of course, go, no. But if you hit that send button one time, thousands of people can end up having copies of it," unquote. So by asserting in this example that trusting someone with your nude image is the equivalent of purposefully handing out nude photos to strangers at Costco, this kind of example completely ignores the actions of people who choose to violate a person's privacy and bodily autonomy by sharing images without consent, and it instead focuses the blame on the consensual act of the victim. So this approach can teach young people to blame victims of non-consensual acts while ignoring both the actions of wrongdoers and the problematic cultural beliefs that normalize privacy invasions and victim blaming. So we know from the research that these kinds of victim blaming messages result in young people who are impacted by digital harms being less likely to reach out to adults for support due to fear of being blamed, shamed, or in trouble. And it also makes peers more likely to blame and shame victims. So it really does not do the things that I think people are hoping it does when they use this kind of victim blaming language. The next common pitfall in digital relationship education is overemphasizing the dangers of tech and underemphasizing the role of systemic discrimination. So what I mean by this is that educational approaches often discuss issues of digital harm as if the technology is to blame. If education simply treats technology as the cause of harm, we will never be successful in addressing tech-facilitated harms that are often linked to issues of discrimination and bias that long pre-exist digital tech. Therefore, rather than teaching young people to fear tech, we need to give them the critical thinking and relationship tools to understand and address issues like gender-based harms in both online and offline spaces. Relatedly, research finds that educational responses fall short when they frame tech-facilitated harms as only impacting young people's online lives, as young people's digital and physical lives are often completely interwoven. So we want to avoid that kind of language in our education as well. Next slide, please. So what should we do instead? Instead of the common focus on things like punishment and responsibilizing victims to avoid digital risks, education could instead help young people to expose and critically engage with the kinds of longstanding pressures, power dynamics, and harmful relational norms that can result in gender-based harms occurring both online and off, while at the same time acknowledging that some aspects of technology do modify and amplify these harms in ways that we need to be aware of, like Chris just talked about. So the educational workshops and resources that our team is currently designing seek to empower young people to think about how all of us and our social institutions have a role to play in challenging discriminatory beliefs and creating healthier relationships in our digital world. So our workshops and resources aim to help young people think about important questions like those in this slide. So we ask them things like, what is okay and not okay to share about others online? So when is it okay to share someone's photo or a private conversation? We talk about how, as Danielle Citron says, there are human frailties that we all have that lead us to post and share things that we later regret. And we need to acknowledge those weaknesses and those beliefs that drive those things that we sometimes post that are mean or hurtful or maybe even hateful. We need to acknowledge those things and that we all confront issues of posting things we wish we hadn't sometimes, so that we can challenge them and think about doing better in the future. And we want to always leave that space for young people to think about, even if they've done some really hurtful things in the past, that there's space for them to challenge those beliefs that led them to do that and to do better in the future. We also ask them to think about what information they share about themselves online. And this is not a way to victim blame, but rather to think about, why might people misuse this information? And what tools and resources do I know to help me if someone mistreats me in a digital space or misuses that information I share about myself online? And what rights do I have to safety in online spaces? So we want to get them to think about what they post as a way to think about those questions about what resources they know, what ways people might harm them using that information, not as a way to blame them or to tell them what they should or shouldn't post. Finally, we ask them how they want tech companies and other institutions, like schools, to help protect their privacy and help support them when things go wrong. So in our workshops, we make sure we avoid pitfalls like only speaking to targets of harm as the sole people responsible for keeping themselves safe. Instead, we want to encourage people with these kinds of questions to think about rights and privacy as something that we're all collectively responsible for protecting, and to think about how tech companies and schools and others in their communities should be playing a role in helping to create safer online and offline spaces. Next slide, please. Try to go quick so that we have time for the Q&A, but I just wanted to give you an example of an activity that we do to help young people consider how they and others in their community can respond in positive ways when TFGBV occurs. So tragic cases like the Rehtaeh Parsons case are often used as a scare tactic to tell young people about how horribly things might turn out if they aren't careful to avoid digital harms. We want to change this narrative and instead use tragic cases as a launching point to talk about how, if a similar case happened today, we could all play a part in responding better. So we talk about the progress we've made as a society to help victims of tech-facilitated harms, such as the introduction of many tools to get non-consensually posted images taken down faster, and feminist social movements that have challenged victim blaming responses to cases like this. At the same time, we acknowledge what work is still left to do to better support victims, and we get young people to think about the responsibilities that various people and institutions have to support this continued work. Next slide, please. So here's an example of an activity we've tried where we use question prompts to get young people to discuss how various people and institutions could respond better to cases of tech-facilitated harms. So here we use the Rehtaeh Parsons case, but we encourage educators to select a scenario that's really relevant to the young people they're working with, and to get young people to think about, for each of these squares, how could the people involved in this scenario where things went badly, how could each of these institutions or these people have responded in a supportive way? So young people are left feeling powerless when educators focus on describing the most tragic cases of TFVB without acknowledging that in such cases, the harms experienced are often amplified by inadequate institutional responses and victim blaming messages from peers, parents, and others. So we want to instead encourage young people that responses to harm can be changed for the better, and that we all play a role in challenging hurtful responses. For instance, we can reassure victims they are not to blame and that they have the right to privacy and safety. We can express to those who cause harm, when it feels safe to do so, that what they did was not acceptable, and we can help them think about how to make amends. And we can challenge a discriminatory belief or policy that helped fuel or normalize the harm. So young people need to be encouraged to imagine what it looks like when someone who is harmed is well supported by institutions and community, and to think about how they can also be one of those people that provides a supportive response. Next slide, please. So the big takeaway from this section of the webinar is that focusing only on digital safety in our education implies that it's our individual responsibility to avoid being harmed. We want to instead create resources that focus on the need to cultivate digital respect, responsibility, and compassion that we owe each other. Next slide, please. So if you want to know more, you can check out our website for educational resources. This slide, and you'll all be provided with the slide. So this slide gives a link to our new infographic on nudes and the law for youth, and a more detailed version for those who work with youth. I've also included the Project Shift guide for trusted adults. It's a really great guide to having tough conversations with young people around this topic, and it takes that really evidence-informed, question-based model that I just talked about. Finally, I've linked here to my review of Nova Scotia's CyberScan unit that talks about what not to do in education on tech facilitated harm, and a bit about what to do instead. So some of the things I just talked about here today are written down there for you if that's more convenient to go back and look at. And final slide, please. So we'll have 20 minutes for Q&A, which is great. So to conclude, if you want to know more about TFGBV among teens, you can read more on our website and follow us on social media to access the resources we're creating for young people and their supporters on this topic. We're currently holding focus groups with young people to learn more about what resources they want and need. So if you have a group of young people that you want us to speak with, let us know. And again, follow us online to find out what we learn in these focus groups and what additional research and resources come out of our work with youth on the DIY Digital Safety Project. And with that, we look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm trying to get the names correctly and in order, in no particular order, of course. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Thank you for informing us. We will be moving to the Q&A portion. I have my colleague, Sabri, who will take some questions in French, and I will start with the English portion. Okay. So the first question we have for the team, and anyone can take it, is there any research or evidence suggesting that certain apps, such as Discord, might be more prone to exposing young people to online gender violence? If so, how can we identify and address potential vulnerabilities in these digital spaces to protect our teenagers? I can read it again. It's a little mouthful. I can put it in the chat. Okay, so I'll read it one more time. Is there any research or evidence suggesting that certain apps, such as Discord, might be more prone to exposing young people to online gender-based violence? If so, how can we identify and address potential vulnerabilities in these digital spaces to better protect our teenagers?
Maybe Chris or Katie, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I can jump into it because this is exactly what a lot of our research in the UK was trying to figure out, not just what is the harm that's happening, but which are the platforms and how are the affordances of the platforms enabling it. Discord is one that actually, so we've just started doing focus groups in Canada. It's starting to emerge. So that is one that I'm already from focus groups hearing about. But it's also very much linked with things like privacy settings. So when young people join a platform, depending on the privacy settings that they have set up, that can actually play a big role in relation to the kinds of harms that they experience. And there are some really great organizations and kind of like group efforts to try to get social media companies to change this, so that if you indicate when you sign up to a social media platform, if you're under the age of 18, the privacy setting should automatically be set to the strictest. Now that will, mitigate some of the harms from strangers, for example, but it won't necessarily mitigate the harms from peers, people who you know. So I think really it kind of depends on the kind of harm that you're experiencing, who is it from, and then there are definitely certain social media apps that are worse for them than others. So like Instagram is often mentioned, Snapchat is often mentioned, but I don't know, Chris, if you want to jump in, or Susie, maybe as it links with privacy.
I'll jump in for one quick second just to say a very small law piece, and then I'll pass it over to Chris. What we're seeing in the progression of laws that are moving forwards, like when we're looking at our Bill C-27, which is proposed changes to privacy law, and also when we're looking at things like laws around artificial intelligence, we are starting to see a shift in the way that the Canadian government is regulating tech issues and privacy issues. And one of the things we are seeing is that they're starting to carve out special laws for children. So for example, children will have more expansive rights to things like deletion of content compared to adults, and so we are starting to see this recognition that children are particularly vulnerable and they do need special rights. And so we will see that legislated in the future. Chris, go ahead if you have something to add.
Yeah, so this goes back to, that's a great question, and it goes back to what I was kind of talking about in my portion, is that we have to remember that these types of spaces are not neutral, and certainly certain spaces have reputations to be more harmful for different reasons. So for instance, like Discord has this particular reputation. Other sites such as 4chan or Reddit, or there's certain sites that do have reputations to be known to be more harmful based on gender or other identities. And so we need to keep that in mind, because while yes, there are certain features that can help protect people, as Katie was talking about, it's also the communities that occupy this space that can have a huge impact on people's experiences. So that's the other piece that I would just add is, while there are going to be different types of features or policies or responses to these types of harms, certainly the reputations and the people who use these spaces can have an impact as well.
Thank you so much for this informative and very rich panel. The audience really appreciated all the resources that you folks shared. I have another question. There seems to be a link between technology-facilitated gender-based violence and unhealthy expressions of masculinity. Do the presenters have information about how technology-facilitated gender-based violence might act as an enforcement or reinforcement of hegemonic masculinity among male youth?
I'll just quickly say that in the report we wrote that I talked about at the beginning, one of the consistent findings that we found across almost all of the literature we looked at was a recommendation that the education needs to move away from talking to potential victims as the people that need to protect themselves, and towards having those conversations with men and boys about what their role is to play in challenging gender-based violence, and to give them the supports and mental health supports that they need to have these conversations and to challenge these harmful beliefs that really negatively impact them as well. So that's definitely a big piece of what we're looking at here. Do others want to jump in on that?
I'll jump on quickly, and again, probably pass it back to Chris, because he's our pro on masculinity. But the one thing that we have seen both in literature on children and youth and adults is that often forms of tech facilitated violence are explicitly used to reinforce gender norms. And so when women transgress from gender norms, this is when they're punished online. We see this particularly with women in leadership positions, girls in leadership positions. I'll share a link to Free to Be Online, which is a great youth international research study that showed, like, young girls, when they start being activists and talking about feminism and talking about gender online, this is when you see a very specific form of harassment online against them that's very gender-based. And same thing within heterosexual relationships, right? Like when women try and assert authority or independence, often tech-facilitated violence is used to control them and reinforce male domination. And I'll share a link to that free to be online report because it's really good. But Chris, I'll pass it.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I think I would just kind of echo what's already been shared, is that certainly identities come into play. And what we're seeing is that in these types of spaces where there's like a lack of, I don't want to say policing, but a lack of accountability in terms of what people say or how they interact, that can perpetuate these types of harms. And certainly then in these online spaces where people can kind of act without consequence, then people feel empowered, and oftentimes in these worst of ways with hegemonic or toxic masculinity, to say or do things that can be more extreme and facilitate online as well as offline violence. So I think this just speaks to the importance of the kind of work that we and others are doing in order to intervene and educate, because we don't want to perpetuate or like present the idea that online spaces are inherently dangerous, but we do want to be able to provide resources and information so that people can interact in safe and healthy ways. And certainly when we think about masculinity, this isn't just by telling men that they're bad, it's by providing resources and support so that men, as well as people of all genders, can interact in healthy and safe ways.
Thank you so much for your answers.
Thank you. I'll take one in English. This one I actually was asked a couple of times. So this has to do with the laws, and there is a question about the laws in the provinces. Are they the same or are they different? So the laws that apply in Canada.
So and law is so complicated. It's the worst. And it's always, it depends, and there's no clear answer. But so across Canada, criminal law is the same. So when we're thinking about crimes, the same criminal laws apply across Canada. So child pornography, non-consensual distribution, all of those laws are the same. But when it comes to civil laws, so if you're going to go to a court to sue someone for hurting you or to get a court order to ask them to take content down, those change province to province. And so they're quite different. So the statutes that I had mentioned for nude image sharing, those are different depending on each province that you're in. And some provinces like Ontario don't have a specific law, but there are some other laws that are what's called common law that could apply to those. So your rights do differ quite differently province to province, in the same way that something like family law is different from province to province. But things like nude image sharing is criminalized, so that applies federally, but then the civil protections are different in each province. And again, we're going to have some plain language summaries that should be up in the next 4 to 6 months that'll help explain the differences province to province, and particularly in somewhere like Quebec. Quebec has really different laws compared to the English-speaking provinces.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Susie.
Thank you. Yes, and I think I'll go with another more specific questions for Susie. When it comes to the Canadian Criminal Code, how will it be applied to foreign citizens who do not reside in Canada involved in these acts of extortions, since the tech-facilitated nature of these crimes means the perpetrator may not be local?
Yeah, so I think it depends. I think often it will be too expensive and too burdensome for police to investigate these crimes. What we're seeing with the sexual extortions for financial purposes, it's often people who are in lower income countries who are doing this. And so if it's like an individual who's in a foreign jurisdiction who's engaged in extortion for $500, the Canadian government is not going to extradite that person to Canada to charge them. So it can be a challenge in finding solutions. But there have been examples, such as the Amanda Todd case, where the person who was causing the harm in her case was an adult Dutch man who was targeting multiple children globally. And he had served his sentence in the Netherlands criminally. And then once that had finished, he was then extradited to Canada and was charged in Canada. So on the books, people can be charged. It doesn't matter what jurisdiction you're in, as long as the harm has occurred in Canada. but the will and the financial capacity of police really varies depending on the severity. So something like the Amanda Todd case that got a lot of publicity and there was a lot of political attention towards it. That case was addressed, even though there was jurisdictional issues, compared to a lot of these sexual extortion cases. I imagine even when they're reported to the police, there's not a lot that they're willing or able to do. And with extradition orders, we often have to have agreements with particular countries to get extradition orders. So if the perpetrator is in a country that doesn't care about Canadian law, then it's a bit of a moot cause, which is a real challenge with tech cases because of the jurisdictional issues that come with them.
Thank you, Susie.
Thank you. Just a little bit of an intersection of politics here, or policies. Here's a question. So the participant is thanking you for sharing your research, and they're wondering, in your research, did you find any correlations between online gender-based violence and current political atmosphere? So that is the rise of the right wing, populist discourses around gender, and anti-genderism.
I can jump in again. I'll hopefully not talk the whole time. But yeah, I think when we see the connection between politics and tech facilitated violence, it's very apparent, right? So I think it's showing up in different ways. So in countries like Canada, we're seeing our own politicians targeted and attacked, which is causing some politicians to choose not to engage in politics anymore. You know, for example, like the mayor of Calgary experienced a lot of racism, and that was one of the big reasons why he chose to not continue seeking a position as a mayor. And so we are seeing people who are being chased out of politics because of gender and because of online harassment. And then if you look internationally, some governments are actually engaging in tech facilitated violence themselves. So if you looked in with Bolsonaro in Brazil and other cases, you'll actually have state violence where states are enacting violence against people, or for example, if being LGBTQ is illegal in a country, some states will actually use apps like Grindr to trap and capture and arrest and torture people for their sexuality. And so politics and tech facilitated violence go hand in hand, and also looking at the government response to tech facilitated violence and how much of a commitment they have to actually providing the remedies and resources that people need, particularly with funding organizations that can provide the supports that young people need in order to address these harms. But politicians and journalists, especially women, it is highly documented that they are some of the highest targeted, worst impacted people with tech facilitated violence.
Thank you, Susie. Anyone else wants to jump to answer the questions? Christopher, Alexa, okay. I have one question that I would like to hear from everyone. How do you feel about the term digital citizenship?
I was hoping Chris would go first. I feel like I mean, I feel great about the term. I threw it out as kind of like one of the potential terms we could use to think about the rights and responsibilities that we owe each other that I talked about. So whether it's talking about digital citizenship, digital compassion, like I threw out as an option there at the end, I think any of those terms get us thinking about what we owe each other and what our institutions owe us, rather than thinking about digital safety, which can feel like a box that we're putting people in of here's all the things you can't do to make sure you stay safe, which is not what actually creates safety in practice.
Well, I can jump in again. I guess. Thanks, Alexa. I get my thought with the term digital citizenship is, yeah, it really gets people to think about like their relationships to one another and how they can function as individuals within a community, but also within a state. The only kind of downside that I would see with this is that when we tend to think about citizenship, not digital citizenship, but we think about citizenship as our relationship with a government, versus just thinking about our relationships with other people or the communities that we occupy. So I think this is a great idea to think, as Alexa just noted, outside the box and not just be concerned about safety and harms, to really think about relationships and responsibility more broadly. My concern with that particular term, just because of how people think about citizenship in general, is that people do tend to think about it in like civil or legal ways, in regard to like taxes and citizenship or voting and citizenship, where I think what we're getting at here is really thinking about how people can be responsible and be responsible actors in online spaces that go beyond just like a one-on-one interaction.
Thank you. I almost want to ask one more question, but I know we only have 3 minutes. So I'm actually going to read the comments because I think it's very well aligned. And maybe get a quick few seconds response. So the question is, during your studies, were teens also talking about using social media as a way to do activism? So like feminism, LGBTQ plus rights, and anti-racism. And they put a little note. This is why I really wanted to read this comment. They want to thank you for the webinar, and that they're indicating that they're doing their master's in technology affiliated violence against women who are public figures, and they feel that your study and your report will be very helpful to their work. Yeah, so you can answer in 1 minute, a few seconds, but I really wanted to capture the comments from the individual.
Just to say, I've actually written a whole book on digital feminist activism, and it was that activism that brought me to this topic. So talking to young people about, and young people, when you talk to them, they are engaged, they are very interested in these topics. So I have a lot of hope and excitement when I talk to young people because they are politically engaged.
Excellent. Yep. Perfect timing. Thank you. So let's I don't want to drag it too much, maybe give people a gift of time, because if I take another question, we may just run out of time. But definitely want to take the moment to really thank Alexa, Susie, Christopher, Kathleen for your time, for your expertise, for sharing your research with us and your report, and also the promises to provide subsequent information to us. We also want to thank the ASL interpreters, Emma and Jennifer, and our French language interpreters, Sylvie and Exan. I hope I got that name correctly. And also want to remind folks not to forget to complete the evaluation so that they can receive their certificates. The link will be shared again in the browser. I think if my colleagues can do that. And we want to thank everyone for their time, and I'm wishing everyone a wonderful rest of day, morning, afternoon, wherever you are. and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.